Welcome to this edition of Hub Hits. We're talking Golden Domes, missile defense, and Canada-U.S. security relations. Great to have on the program right now Michael O'Hanlon from Brookings, where he's the Director of Research in the Foreign Policy Program. Michael, great to be in touch with you.
Thanks for having me.
Let's jump right in here. What is the history to date of the success of these types of missile defense systems? I'm not talking about, the types of systems we're seeing deployed right now in Ukraine or Israel. Instead, the type of system that might underwrite something like the Golden Dome, i.e. a system for continental defense here in North America, I guess set up to establish an ability to defer and deflect the threats related to intercontinental ballistic missile attack.
Right. Well, we already have such a system, and it could already defend Canada because it is based on the west coast of the United States with most of the capability in Alaska and some in California. And it's intended and focused primarily on the possibility of a North Korean attack on North America, presumably the United States. But again, the trajectories are such that Canada would be along the way and could be defended if necessary as well. And that concept goes back to essentially the early 2000s. Deployment happened largely under President Obama, and there have been upgrades to the system, but it's based on a kind of technology that is pretty good, but not maybe quite as 21st century futuristic as some of the ideas in Golden Dome. And it is related to what we're seeing in Ukraine and also in Israel. But as you point out, longer range in capability, bigger rockets, ability to get to a faster speed and get to outer space. So in that sense, there are a number of types of systems that are already functional that could, in theory, provide a somewhat expanded capability of the type we've already got. If you put a couple of these systems, for example, on the East Coast of the United States, you could defend the United States and Canada from an Iranian ballistic missile launch. Right now, there are parts of our East Coast and perhaps even part of your East Coast that the Alaska-California system might not be able to cover if the launch came from the east rather than from the west. Just one last point, and I'll finish with this overall framing. All of this assumes, of course, that the interceptors would work. And what we've seen in testing is that they work about half the time. Now, we have, I think, 48 interceptors deployed. And so if you were only under attack from a few ICBMs from North Korea, there's a very high probability we'd manage to get them all. However, if North Korea were able to either sabotage some of our sensors or deploy decoys that might fool the sensors on the interceptors, there are other ways in which you could imagine this system failing to function the way it was intended, which is why most missile defense proponents like the idea of a multi-layered defense system, which provides, therefore, insurance policy, hedging against the possibility any one layer would fail or be saturated or otherwise defeated by an attacker. So with Golden Dome, it really all depends. Are you talking about a small launch from a country like North Korea or Iran? By the way, Iran doesn't have the capability yet, but they could someday. Are you talking about an accidental launch from a country like China or Russia, or a limited threatened strike? Or are you talking about an all-out strike from China or Russia, where the demands on the defense, of course, are much, much greater? And I'm not sure we're going to be in a position to deal with that in my lifetime.
Yeah. Just to go back, though, to, the United States has spent over $400 billion developing the systems that you have to date. My understanding, Michael, is that the testing of those systems, you're right, has about a 50% success rate, but those are in fairly ideal conditions in terms of weather, ideal conditions in terms of the types of missiles. These are not MIRVed missiles. They are not missiles with multiple reentry vehicles. They don't have glide warheads. They don't have a lot of the common, in a sense, defensive technology that warhead designers have developed over decades now to ensure that when there are, the use of countermeasures like missile systems, that they face a formidable opponent in a highly technological warhead that is going to deliver that payload, that strike load on target. So Michael, I guess, for Canadians maybe who are a little bit skeptical of spending 60 odd billion dollars, at least that's the price tag that your president has potentially flagged as our cost to get under the so-called Golden Dome. I mean, what, if any, reassurance can you provide us that this is technology that we have now could defend against, let's say, a sophisticated North Korean ICBM, which surely, with all the technology transfer going on right now between North Korea and Russia, could well have, MIRV warheads, could have glide warheads, could have other technology that would easily reduce, unfortunately, the, albeit fairly impressive, success rate of 50% on your current interception system?
Yeah, those are great questions. And the way you finish by asking about how well would this do against a future North Korean threat, I think sort of cuts to the crux of the matter. Because what I would say is I think we'd have a pretty good chance, but not a guarantee. And so let's go through your systems one by one. MIRVs. MIRVs have been around, as you know, forever, for a half century. And they're not that sophisticated because it just means several warheads per ICBM, per
up to a dozen,
missile, and they can be separated individually and directed to slightly different aim points, but they're all still flying ballistic trajectories, predictable trajectories. So you could use an interceptor against each MIRVed warhead if you needed to. And so that threat, I think we could handle. However, you mentioned glide bombs or maneuvering bombs or ICBMs that dispense a lot of chaff and maybe mylar balloons into space that have a certain radar reflection that is similar to a real warhead. And because you're out in outer space when these things are dispersed, the fact that the balloon is light doesn't change its trajectory relative to the heavier warhead. And so anything that's done out in outer space, like these mid-course systems would be expected to do, has that vulnerability that you can't use air to separate heavy things from light decoys. In the atmosphere, your maneuvering or glide bomb warheads become a greater concern. And so what you really need, again, is a multi-layered defense where, depending on the type of threat and the one that North Korea could operationalize most effectively, one layer may wind up working better than another. All this, to me, is to say you should spend some money on this, but not enough. Or not so much that it bankrupts you. Sorry to misspeak. You should spend some money on this, but not a huge amount. And so when President Trump starts talking $60 billion, to me, that's getting into a realm of expenditure where if I were Canadian, I'd be skeptical. Also, we know President Trump would like more help from NATO defending Eastern Europe. If I was going to choose between Canada putting a lot of money into Golden Dome and Canada putting more money into its expeditionary forces to be able to get a couple of brigades into the Baltic states quickly, above and beyond the forces you already have there now, I might prefer to see you put this into lower tech ground combat capability and let the United States worry about the defense of North America, because we're going to have to defend North America just as a matter of physics, with or without your help. I mean, Canada, in some sense, is going to get protection of a limited amount, whether it participates in the architecture or not.
Yeah. Any concern here, Michael, that for these systems to ultimately be successful, to create that layered type of system you want, what the next generation of technology would be to intercept, after launch, well before a missile reaches its terminal phase, when it's effectively in its final boost. That's your best chance of intercepting an ICBM. It would require, in a sense, space-based weapons that would be stationary or in some proximity to North Korea, Iran, or other locations, so that they could actually target these missiles in effectively, minutes after launch. Any concerns on your part about the weaponization of space? This is something, historically, for the last 75 years, we've had various international treaties to try to stop this, to try to stop the militarization of space. I just wonder if you and the Brookings Institution have any concerns here that missile defense systems are inevitably going to lead, if we are going to pursue this technology to its logical conclusion, to stationing weapons in space, and therefore most likely provoking our allies to create countermeasures and counter weapons in space to therefore reduce the threat that our initial deployment into space would create for them in terms of their ground-based launch missiles.
Yeah, there's a lot in that question, and I think you get to, again, the heart of the matter. First of all, if you're worried primarily about North Korea, you don't necessarily need to be in space. You can do boost phase systems that are essentially unmanned aerial vehicles operating out of northern Japan. And because North Korea is small and because we have an ally right next to North Korea, you have that option. It would be a little more complicated with Iran, which does not yet have ICBM missiles capable of reaching North America, as I'm sure you know, but could someday. But because Iran is bigger and because we don't have quite the same kind of ally to its north and west, but we do have Turkey, we have other NATO member states, and so you could, in theory, have airborne systems that you could put up in a crisis that would allow you to shoot at these Iranian ICBMs in their boost phase in the first few minutes of flight. So that one may be solvable without having to go into space. Now, you use two words about going into space that are interesting and slightly different. You talk about the militarization of space, which, by the way, we've already done.
Yes,
because there are
that's
so
well
many
underway.
military satellites
Yep.
for sensors, for communications, et cetera, as you well know. And then the weaponization of space, which we really haven't yet done, putting objects that can explode or otherwise destroy other objects in orbit. We do have a lot of systems that are based on ground that can reach into space today and destroy things, but we don't base them in space. So we're in this weird place where space is sort of already militarized, but not really yet weaponized. And on purely normative grounds, I would prefer to stay there.
Yeah.
However, if I thought that we could deploy a really effective missile defense system by weaponizing space, I would not dismiss the possibility out of hand. But here's where I wind up perhaps in the same place as you, if I'm judging correctly where you may be with your questions. I don't think space is a very promising place for us to put weapons because they're really hard to develop
And hard to
get to
defend.
space
Yeah.
and keep in space, and they keep moving, which is really inconvenient if you're trying to have them in the right place to provide defense. So you've got to wind up having a dozen, 2 dozen, either lasers or interceptors in space at any given moment so that you can create a mesh essentially over the entire Earth's surface and be able to deal with the fact that these sensors and, these weapons in space, interceptors or lasers, need to be in low Earth orbit to be able to be within range of the objects they're shooting at, and therefore will keep moving relative to Earth in such a way that requires you to have a constellation of weapons for any one to be in the correct position at a given time.
Yeah.
So I wind up being a big skeptic on weaponizing space, but I do think we should put better sensors in space and make a little better North American defense system than we have today.
Final question. The threat of nuclear weapons has been persistent and long-term. We just saw between India and Pakistan a very alarming weekend, to say the least, in the last month. Are you concerned at all, Michael, that these types of discussions around things like the Golden Dome, they create a kind of false sense of security about these weapons and the existential threat that their existence represents, the ability for not simply the annihilation of a single country or nation, heaven forbid, but in a worst case scenario, the end of human civilization as we know it. Do you have any philosophical or other concerns that in pursuing missile defense and now, in a sense, taking it well into the domain of politics, as your president has done recently, and bilateral relations with Canada, we're really downplaying and not maybe understanding the fundamental risk that we face, which is simply the existence of large-scale nuclear arsenals like the types in America, China, and Russia?
Yeah, I think that if we create an illusion or delusion that we can make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete, as Ronald Reagan famously said 40 years ago, that's not only wrong, it is dangerous. And it can also produce an offense-defense arms race. But let me say two more things that, again, make me fall back on the idea that we should improve our own current North American defense system and expand it a bit. One of them is, you're probably aware, China's dramatically expanding its offensive nuclear weapons capabilities.
Yes.
And since China and Russia are increasingly operating in unison in world politics, and since the American allies that have nukes are really just France and Britain, to some extent Israel, if you want to factor them in, China and Russia are going to have substantially more nuclear weapons than the West pretty soon. We could react to that in one of three ways: decide we don't care, or decide we're going to compete with them and try to equalize, or build some defenses that could at least neutralize a limited fraction of the overall Russian and Chinese capability. Of those three options, some limited defense may be the least bad option. One last point, if you don't mind, and I'll finish on this. We're speaking just 2 days after this amazing Ukrainian attack on Russian aircraft within Russia, which underscores how we shouldn't just fixate on long-range missiles. We have to think about integrated air and missile defense for North American airspace in general, including from threats that could be launched from Canadian or American or Mexican territory against targets in any one of those three countries or a neighboring country. And so I think an air and missile defense has to do more than just deal with this hypothetical long-range missile strike. It should be modest and limited, but it should focus on drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles. And I think there are ways to get a limited capability along these lines without busting the bank. For example, we already have a lot of Navy ships, and we have a lot of Army systems called THAAD that we deploy abroad with our forces. We could build some to be based here and maybe have a few bases along the North American littoral that would include those kinds of shorter range missile and air defense systems. But those are also capable against long range threats. They've been proven to work even against long range threats. And so I think with that kind of a partially jury rigged system, you can keep the price tag down and you can give yourself some limited defense capability. So that's probably where I would wind up.
Okay. Michael Hanlon with the Brookings Institution. Thank you so much for coming on Hub Hits today. Great conversation, great insights. I've really appreciated your time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
If you're enjoying these in-depth conversations on the big policy questions facing Canada in every domain, including security, please subscribe to our channel. Click on that little notification bell. You'll get our next video served to you almost instantaneously. And if you're listening to this on our podcast channel, write a review. Tell us what you think about the interview we just had. We read all of our reviews carefully, and we appreciate your feedback. Thanks for listening and watching. I'm Rudyard Griffiths. Until next time, bye-bye.